I remember participating in a study of all the newspapers, I think not just California, but large group of Western newspapers, big and small, maybe not the LA Times biggest papers, but the regional papers, Bakersfield, Fresno, down to the smaller towns. And each newspaper that participated in this study would send in a kind of P&L, and it was anonymous. So when the data was all collected, you couldn't reverse engineer which P&L you were looking at. But you could see in general, what did a newspaper spend on paper, what did it spend on editorial, what did it spend on trucks, ink. And what was interesting was, across a very broad group of newspapers, the cost of the newsroom was about 10% of the revenue. And in the most lavish newspapers that we all knew or could guess were the expensive ones, it was 12%, hardly ever 15%. And the cheapest, nickel-biting publishers spent 8%, but it was in a very narrow band between like 8% and 12% and hovering right around 10%. So the first thought that we all had was, well, if you could get rid of all these other costs, if you could get rid of the trucks and get rid of the paper and distribute the newspaper electronically, it shouldn't affect the newsroom at all. That turned out to be wrong, but the reason that it was wrong was not the mass exodus of readers. The reason it was wrong was the advertisers wanted to follow different behaviors. So you could not, you could keep running your costs down, but you could never quite reduce your costs to make up for the fact that advertising was moving away. And I think that's one of the things that hasn't gotten fully understood.
Well, also, I think that there was a grasping at the last remnant of the old world of the economics of newspapers, where there was a monopoly, only there wasn't a monopoly anymore. And so, publishers and newspaper media company owners would look to newsrooms when they started cutting back, because they're just the news people, even though it was only 10% of their costs. But at the same time, the newsrooms had a problem. In my view, it was what I used to call a higher calling disease. And the perhaps apocryphal story is of the guy who's at his terminal pounding away on a story, and someone says, hey, you got a call from one of your readers. And he said, I don't have time to do that, I'm doing journalism.
Yeah.
And so I think what happened is, not everyone, but I think as a profession, we lost our way. And we forgot that the purpose of journalism is to serve the public. And the public became like, icky, what do you mean comments on my story? I don't want comments on my story.
Your point about the monopoly is a good point. One of the other monopolies that newspapers had was they were this gathering place for information. So I think we're old enough to remember you were thinking about going to a movie, and for a quarter you could buy a newspaper, flip open to the newspaper, to the movie listings, figure out what time the show is and throw the paper away. But with the arrival of the internet and so much of this information being free and at your fingertips, there was no real content in the newspaper. A lot of the content in the paper was not very special to the paper.
And not very current.
And not, as well as, And so I think that was missed. We like to think of it as a technology revolution, but a lot of it was a competition revolution, in the sense there were many other places you could get the same news.